Hello, everyone. As we have covered already the respiratory tract, now we're going to talk specifically about the physiology part of the respiratory system. And in learning outcome number 1, we're going to talk about the steps of respiration, also commonly known as breathing. Let's start with the basic steps in respiration. There are 5 basic steps that are listed here. We have ventilation, pulmonary gas exchange, transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide by the blood, systemic gas exchange, which basically means that it's going to the systemic circuit, and cellular respiration. Let's talk first about ventilation, which is where the air will flow into and out of the lungs. And movement of air into the lungs can also be called inspiration, also inhalation, and movement of air out of the lungs is referred to as expiration or exhalation. And inspiration will allow oxygen to enter the lungs, whereas expiration will permit the carbon dioxide to leave the lungs. Next, we have the pulmonary gas exchange, which, like the name already says, the gases are going to be exchanged between the alveoli, or the air sacs of the lungs, and the blood in the pulmonary capillaries. And in this step, the pulmonary capillary blood will gain oxygen and will lose carbon dioxide. And this is also referred to as external respiration. Next, we have the transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide by the blood. And the blood will carry oxygen from the lungs to the tissues and carbon dioxide from the tissues back to the lungs. Next, we have the systemic gas exchange, where the gases are going to be exchanged between the blood in the systemic capillaries and the tissue cells of the body. And in this step, the systemic capillary blood will lose oxygen and gain carbon dioxide. And this is referred to as internal respiration as well. Last, we have what we call the cellular respiration, where the cells will consume the oxygen that's being carried through the systemic circuit and give off carbon dioxide as metabolic reactions break down nutrient molecules in order to produce ATP for energy. Therefore, these are the main steps in respiration process. Let's go over a little bit of a review of the upper respiratory tract. So the nose, also known as the external nares, will bring the air into the respiratory system from the external environment. Within the respiratory system, we're going to have the respiratory mucosae, which will produce mucus that will then trap the particles and also lubricate the airways. Then this air will travel down through the pharynx, which is actually this common passageway for not only the air that's being inspired or taken into the body, but also food. And from there, it will pass through the larynx, which basically routes air and food into the proper channels, either to the trachea, if it's air, or to the esophagus, if it's food. The larynx is also responsible for vocalization because it has the glottis, which are your vocal cords. From the larynx, it will go down the trachea, which basically is just a tube that will carry air to the primary bronchi, which are these 2 tubes over here that split at the end of the trachea. And the primary bronchi will then transport the air into the lungs. It will branch out several times, and this is what we will see on the next slide. We have already talked about how the trachea will split into the primary bronchi, which then splits already inside of the lungs into the secondary and then into the tertiary bronchi. And these will then divide several times, giving rise to smaller bronchioles, which will branch into even smaller bronchioles that are called the terminal bronchioles. And these, in turn, will branch out into these very microscopic branches that are called respiratory bronchioles. And these will penetrate deeper into the lungs and subdivide into what we call the alveolar ducts, which will contain the alveoli, and this will give rise to the alveolar sacs, which contain numbers of alveoli that are going to be arranged in clusters as we see from this image. Now, an alveolar sac is actually comparable to a bunch of grapes, with each grape being an alveolus. And it has been estimated that the lung contain about 300 million alveoli, and this will definitely provide this immense total surface area of about the size of a racquetball court for gas exchange. That's how important it is for our survival for this gas exchange to occur. And this extensive branching from the trachea actually resembles an inverted tree, and this is why it's commonly referred to as the bronchial tree. So everything after the trachea all the way to the alveolar sacs is referred to as the bronchial tree. Therefore, as we can see, the lungs will contain most of the components of the respiratory zone within the respiratory system. Now let's focus specifically on the alveoli, which if we're referring to it as a singular would be alveolus. So in this case right over here we have an alveolus, which is the sac that's filled with air and that extends from the respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar ducts, and the alveolar sacs. Now an alveolus will consist of little more than an epithelium that will be supported by a basement membrane, and the thinness of the alveolar wall is going to be vital for the process of the gas exchange. Think of it this way: because we need to have a gas exchange occur really fast, then it makes sense that the alveolar wall will be thin, because if it was thick, then it would take longer for the gas exchange to occur. And this is why the alveoli epithelium is made up of simple squamous epithelium. Now, this epithelium will consist of two types of cells, what we call type 1 alveolar cell, which are more numerous, and the type 2 alveolar cells. Type 1, they're the ones that will form a nearly continuous lining of the alveolar wall, and they are the main sites of gas exchange. On the other hand, the type 2 alveolar cells, which are also called septal cells, they will secrete this alveolar fluid, which will keep the surface between the cells and the air moist. Included in the alveolar fluid is this component that's called surfactant, which is a complex mixture of lipids and proteins. And the surfactant is important because it lowers the surface tension of the alveolar fluid, and this reduces the tendency of the alveoli to collapse, which is important to maintain a normal respiration. We can also see right over here, associated with the alveolar epithelium, these alveolar macrophages. And these cells, they're basically roaming around this alveolar space, and they will phagocyte these fine dust particles, debris, or any microbes that may be present in the alveoli. Also, as we can see on the outer surface of the alveoli, there's going to be this extensive network of pulmonary capillaries, and each capillary will consist of a single layer of endothelial cells and a basement membrane. Now, this capillary supply is so dense that the alveoli are considered to be surrounded by nearly a continuous sheet of blood. Notice as well the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the air spaces in the lungs and the blood, which basically takes place by diffusion across the alveolar and the capillary walls, and together they will form the respiratory membrane. Let's talk about the cystic fibrosis, which is this inherited disease of secretory epithelium that affects the airways, the liver, the pancreas, the small intestine, and the sweat glands. Basically, anything that has a secretory function. It is the most common lethal genetic disease in Caucasians, and it occurs once in every about 2,500 births. So it's a very common disease. The cause of cystic fibrosis is actually a genetic mutation that affects a chloride ion channel that's called the cystic fibrosis transmembrane conductance regulator, or CFTR for short, which will permit the movement of chloride ions across the plasma membrane of any epithelial cell. As we can see right over here, the chloride now is exiting the cell. The mutation actually reduces the volume of this periciliary fluid, resulting in this very thick dehydrated mucus that does not drain easily and actually obstructs the internal passageways of several organs. So let's see what happens under normal conditions. We can see that the production of the periciliary fluid involves the transport of proteins in the basolateral membrane, also in the apical membrane of the epithelial cells. Sodium ions and potassium ions and chloride ions, they're going to be actively taken up by the cell via this sodium potassium chloride symporter, which is located in the basolateral membrane, as we see right over here. Now the gradient for these ions is going to be established by the sodium potassium ATPase pump that is also present in the basolateral membrane. The chloride ions then will leave the cell through the chloride channel, which is the CFTR, in the apical membrane, as we can see over here, and then it will enter into the periciliary fluid. Now, the movement of chloride ions actually creates this electrical gradient that will cause sodium ions to flow from the extracellular fluid, represented here by this purple area, which we can see over here written ECF, representing the extracellular fluid, into the periciliary fluid by passing between the cells, as we can see over here. Now, water then will flow in the same direction due to the osmotic gradient that's created by the sodium and the chloride ions. Remember that water always follows sodium, so the water movement will establish the normal volume of the periciliary fluid. Now, in most forms of cystic fibrosis, the defective chloride ion channel is going to be degraded by the cell and consequently is not inserted into the plasma membrane, and this will cause the chloride secretion by the cell to decrease. So if there's no chloride being released into the periciliary fluid, this will result in a decrease of the movement of sodium and water into the periciliary fluid. And this will cause the volume of the periciliary fluid to reduce since there's less water. And it will also cause the mucus to thicken and to clog the airways. Now, the buildup of mucus also makes it easier for bacterial infections to occur because bacteria likes to grow rapidly in this accumulated mucus. And clogging and infection of the airways will lead to this difficulty in breathing, as you can imagine. And then eventually there's going to be the destruction of the lung tissue. Now, even though this genetic disease affects other secretory structures, the lung disease will account for most of the deaths from cystic fibrosis. We will have obstruction of small bile ducts in the liver, which will interfere with digestion and also disrupt the liver function. We will also see the clogging of the pancreatic ducts that prevent digestive enzymes from reaching the small intestine. And with respect to the reproductive systems, the blockage of the vas deferens, which can also be called the ductus deferens, will lead to infertility in males. And the formation of this dense mucus plugs in the vagina will also restrict the entry of the sperm into the uterus, also leading to infertility in females. Now, treatment of cystic fibrosis involves chest therapy, which basically means that you're going to be tapping on the chest to loosen the mucus and release the mucus. You can also take mucus thinning drugs. You can also use antibiotics to treat the bacterial infections. You can also alter your diet and even give exogenous pancreatic enzymes to help with the digestive functions. Now, the gene for CFTR has already been identified, which is the great news, and scientists are hoping actually to introduce the gene into an affected epithelial cells in order to restore normal chloride secretion. So there is hope in the near future for treatment of cystic fibrosis.